India's aviation sector is currently facing several headwinds. Rising crude prices, the rupee depreciation has put a further strain on the balance sheet of airlines. According to the International Air Transport Association, or IATA, infrastructure constraints and excessive costs on account of government policies are adding to the sector's growth woes. To discuss this further, we're now joined by Alexandre de Juniac, the Director General and CEO of IATA. Mr. de Juniac, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. I want to start by asking you about just that. We talk about the growth opportunity of India's aviation sector. In your IATA report, you talk about celebrating 50 months of consecutive double-digit growth. By 2037, 500 million passengers are expected to travel from and within India. That's treble the numbers that we're seeing today. And yet, you say that India is perhaps one of the most challenging markets for airline companies. Why is that?
First of all, India is a fantastic growing market. As you have recalled, it has faced a 50 uninterrupted growth, 50 months of uninterrupted double-digit growth, and we expect this growth to continue. So the potential, the demand is there. The point is that we have constraints on the supply side, mainly because we have infrastructure constraint, not enough airport, probably an air traffic control that is not able to cope with future growth if the right investments are not made, on the one hand, and excessive costs that are putting a lot of pressure on the P&Ls of our members, the airlines. So the airlines are having a growing market, but enormous cost due to various factors. First of all, the fuel price. Secondly, the decline in the value of the rupee, whereas they bear costs that are labeled in dollars. And thirdly, there are various other costs, taxes, charges, fees, that are also putting pressure on their profit and loss account. So it means that it's great in terms of growth, but it's difficult in terms of making money. And we have told the Indian authorities, do whatever you can to lower the cost for airlines if you want to have a strong airline sector able to cope with the growth.
Mr. de Juniac, you know, this has been IATA's pitch to the Indian government for the last several years, including the last 4 years of this particular government. Are you hopeful of being able to see any forward movement? I'll just talk about ATF, because the demand to bring ATF under the ambit of the GST has been a long-standing one. So are you at all feeling hopeful or optimistic? Do your members feel hopeful or optimistic that there could be some measures that will be announced at this point in time to try and alleviate the pain and the stress that this sector is faced with on account of higher crude prices and the depreciating rupee?
First of all, we are fairly optimistic, because for now 4 years we have had good relations with Indian governments. We recognize that a lot of things and a lot of efforts have been done. You know, new airports have been built. Internal connectivity in India has been significantly improved due to regional connection scheme, but there are still improvements to be made. So, and especially on taxation and cost. And we are asking the Indian government, you know, to not to impose, you know, GST on domestic fares, and not to impose taxes on some international fares, which is contradictory to ICAO obligations. We ask them to reduce the fuel cost by reducing the excise on fuel and on various airport charges. And we have been heard, and I am not in the secret of government decisions, but I think that we can expect some good news from the government I hope in the coming weeks and months, that would favor the Indian industry.
Okay, you're hopeful that we could see some forward movement from the government. But, you know, when you talk about government policies imposing excessive costs, if I could ask you to break that up for us, I mean, what is the difference between the kind of taxes and levies that India imposes versus other markets, developed as well as some emerging markets, perhaps even China, if we could do that comparison? I mean, how much higher are the costs on account of taxes and levies in India versus these other markets?
I will take the two main examples for us of first the cost of fuel. The cost of fuel is coming, of course, from the price of fuel, but in India particularly from the various taxes that are put on fuel. It means that for Indian airlines, the cost of fuel represents 34% of their cost, whereas for on average in the rest of the world, the cost of fuel represents 24% of the cost. So it's an enormous difference, and that is mainly due to various taxes that are imposed on fuel. That's the first example. Second example, we have a lot of taxes that are put on the GST is applicable to fares in India, and on first of all on domestic travel, but also on some international fares, and that is an additional cost that the Indian airlines have to bear that the others do not have on their profit and loss account. So it adds an additional constraints on the Indian aviation sector. And I do not mention some import taxes on various spare parts for MRO and all that stuff.
Okay, so you're saying that on fuel itself, there is a 10% difference between what India charges and what other countries are doing. But I want to talk about this business of how airlines are dealing with what has now become a price war, a discounting war that we've seen in the market. I mean, your members complain about the fact that the government is imposing excessive taxes and levies, but how are they making this much more sustainable? Every CEO we talk to talks about the unsustainability of discounting, and yet we see another scheme being launched. Is this unusual? Is this a practice that you see in other mature markets?
In fact, we have seen some price wars in other markets. In Europe, for instance, there is a very strong, a very tough competition, and it leads to very low fares. We have seen that in the US in some period, not now, but in the past. We see that in Southeast Asia. So there are other areas in the world in which competition is so hard that the prices are very, very low. And India is one of them. India is one of them, but that's the market and that's competition, and it will be regulated naturally by the market forces. And so what we advocate is for the government to do whatever it can to lower the cost, so the other side of the profit and loss. And because it's not in our responsibility to ask our members not to compete.
Mr. De Juniac, no, I understand that it's not your responsibility to ask your members not to compete, but the government of India also has fiscal constraints. So I go back to my question that you have strong demand. We've just put out those numbers, which you said, the demand picture looks strong, it's expected to continue, and yet we're seeing yields only declining. And that's where the question comes. Isn't it the responsibility of the aviation sector, of the airlines themselves, to also ensure that they remain viable?
For sure. No, so I do not ask government to do everything. It's a shared responsibility between the airline and the government to cut costs. So we ask the government for his part, what is under his responsibility, but we are absolutely convinced that the airlines have also their part to do to cut costs. And it's what has happened in other parts of the world. In Europe, for instance, legacy carriers who have been facing a strong competition from low cost, they have significantly cut costs. So it's also something that has to be done in India, but it would be nice if the government would make his own part. It would be helpful. Otherwise, the financial health of the Indian airlines will be severely hit.
Well, it would be helpful if the government brings in some support for this sector, as you're pointing out, by way of cutting down on costs. But what is the prognosis today? How fearful are you that we could perhaps be on the verge of losing another airline in India on account of financial stress?
You know, I hope that it would not be the case, because the development of the sector is so high, and the future growth is so important that we need all the airlines and even more to be able to cope with that growth and to contribute to that success. But we have to recognize, and it's true in many parts of the world, even if airlines are making better results and are more profitable now than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it is still a fragile sector of the industry. Yeah? You have high cost, you have fixed cost, it's capital intensive and low margins. So when you accumulate all of that, you conclude that you have to pay attention every day. We are not in a we are never in a comfort zone. And in India particularly.
We're never in a yes, never in a comfort zone in India, particularly when it comes to aviation. Those are your words, sir. Let me then ask you, given the demand outlook, while the industry is facing tough times today, perhaps in the midst of a cyclical downturn, but given the demand scenario, do you believe that there will be takers, foreign airlines who would want to invest in an Indian carrier today? The FDI limit is 49%. Do you believe that they would want to invest in a legacy carrier in India today, or perhaps even set up operations in India?
First of all, everyone must be aware that these foreign investment limitations exist almost everywhere. So in India it's 49%, but it's also 49% in the EU. It's 25% in the US. So it's something that is existing everywhere, not mainly for economic reasons, but also for sovereignty reasons, for the connectivity of the country, the political interest to have a national or national carriers. So that's an approach that exists everywhere. Secondly, should it prevent foreign investors to take a stake in an Indian carrier? No. In many areas of the world, we see a foreign investment or foreign investors taking stakes in local companies. In Europe, a lot of companies are partly owned by American or Gulf investors or Korean investors. So it's common business now. The point is, as you have mentioned, that if you invest, you have to expect a return. And so if the financial health of the Indian Airlines is too tense, too difficult, it will deter investors from bringing money without enough returns. But that's normal financials. That's nothing new.
Sure. No, it's nothing new, and commercial viability is, of course, the question that investors will have to grapple with. And you're absolutely right. FDI restrictions exist everywhere, not just specifically in the aviation market here in India. But what about the national carrier, Air India? The government tried to bring investors on board for Air India. That process has been shelved, at least for now. What's the sense that you get when you speak with your members about interest in Air India?
You know, first of all, that's a purely private deal, so we do not intervene in private investment or in private deals. The point that I have heard from the minister today about the privatization of Air India was that he was perfectly conscious of the failure of the previous attempt. So they are working on 4 or 5 key points. Restructuring, financially boosting the balance sheet, working on cost to prepare what I understand is a future privatization of Air India, but in different conditions that would attract more easily investors from the private sector, whether they are Indian or foreigners. There is no rule about the nationality of potential investors in Air India, but the file has to be worked out and presented and restructured differently to be attractive. And I understand that is the plan of the government. And we support, of course, this type of plan.
Okay,
I
Mr.
think
de
it's
Juniac.
wise. It's business-wise.
Right. Yes, that it certainly is. Let me end then by asking you, given where we find ourselves in the Indian aviation market today, what is the kind of debt that you expect this industry to be saddled with? How concerned would you be about the health of this sector, about the viability of this sector, given the situation with crude, given the situation with the rupee, and the legacy balance sheet issues that some of the airlines are dealing with?
We are concerned about the financial health of the airline sector because nobody is making money. It's not normal. But we have faced similar situation in other parts of the world in previous time. But to cope with that, to be able to successfully put the sector back on track, strong measures have to be made. Measure on cost by airlines, measure on cost by the government, infrastructure development, smart regulation by the government. All this set of measures has to be put into force to favor the aviation, the Indian aviation sector. With the only purpose, the only target, is to be able to cope with this fantastic growth which is in front of us, with a financially sound and healthy airlines. We have to work together to achieve that.
Mr. de Juniac, we'll have to leave it there. Yes, a collaborative effort will be needed to ensure that Indians not just fly, but airline companies also make some money. That's the key question that IATA is putting forward, that why is it so difficult for airlines to make money in India? Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. Thanks very much for your time, and we'll see you again when you return. That's the Director General of the International Air Transport Association, IATA, worried about the financial health of India's aviation sector. Time for a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere.